So back to the present. If you see finance as kind of a mirror on our values, what did the housing bubble and the mass securitization of risky mortgage debt say about who we are, or perhaps who we were, as a society?
I suppose I see this as a political experiment as much as a financial experiment. In the Ascent of Money, I talk about the origins of the property-owning democracy as a concept, which is actually quite a recent concept. In the 19th century, it was never expected that a majority of households would own their own homes. In fact, in Europe, it was an aristocratic elite who owned property, and more or less everybody else was a tenant. It's from the 1930s that people start to argue, in the United States particularly, but also in Britain, that it's desirable to have people own their own homes, that it will actually influence their political and social outlook. They will become less susceptible to political radicalism as property owners. And so a whole set of institutions date back to the 1930s designed to make it easier to get a mortgage and buy a home. One example is Fannie Mae, about which we've heard so much recently, a product of the New Deal designed to widen, deepen, and underwrite the U.S. mortgage market. We've been conducting this experiment in widening home ownership for decades now, since the 30s, and we sort of reached the maximum point with the subprime era, when we sought to increase the percentage of households owning their own homes up towards nearly 70%. And I think we just took the marginal tenant and turned the marginal tenant into a homeowner. We essentially invited people to join the property-owning democracy who couldn't quite make the payments.
The shame of debt was replaced by the shame of renting.
Renting certainly began to be looked down on. I mean, you could read articles by Skip Gates, my colleague at Harvard in African American Studies, saying what a wonderful thing Margaret Thatcher did in selling council houses to the working classes in the 1980s. In Britain, we ought to be doing the same thing for African American communities in the United States, because when they become property owners, families, whether they be African American or not, change their attitudes in positive ways. He wrote that article in the New York Times more or less the week before the subprime meltdown began, and I remember thinking it was richly ironic that this notion was being bought by intellectuals like him, because there was clearly a profound problem. The way that the subprime mortgages were constructed meant that they were almost bound to blow up after a couple of years, which made the beginning of this crisis quite easy to predict. It wasn't hard to see that as these mortgages reset, as the terms got nasty after the initial teaser period, a great many families were going to default. That was one thing about this crisis that was not surprising.
Especially because middle and working class wages in the last 10 years were not going up,
right?
Like the top few percent.
I think
and like the mortgages would have demanded that their wages went up.
We should look back on this as the age of leverage, as a period in which we used debt as a substitute for meaningful growth in incomes. And we're living through the painful end of this age right now.